So this talk comes in really in two parts, and the first is to tell the truth, and then asking people to act as if the truth is real. And the second part is more sort of hopeful, what to do about it. So you may or may not understand that there's a fairly decent crisis in terms of the way that we find science and politics interacting in the way that we make changes to the world around us and the way that we manage our societies. And it's important for us to always make sure that people understand that grief is a perfectly acceptable part of what we're doing with Extinction Rebellion, and I think it's an important difference between us and a lot of other movements and campaigns. Grief is sort of multi-layered affair, and some of you look quite young, so hopefully maybe you don't know as much about it as I do. But it's important for us to make sure that we understand that when we talk about the reality of the situation that we're in as a species, it's quite difficult to deal with, and so we ask people to be mindful of their own journey through acceptance and the realisation of what it means, and also to be kind to one another and to find ways to be open and supportive to people, because different people have very different experiences and ways of dealing with grief. So the first part, the ecological crisis, climate collapse, and beyond. When we set out on our mission to start a rebellion, we talked about shifting the Overton window. Does anyone know? Do you know what the Overton window is? No. Okay, so the Overton window is really the frame within which you find like the acceptable public conversation, and that might be within politics, but certainly for us it's meant increasing the use of the term extinction has certainly moved the window of what I think is acceptable in terms of the language that we use when we talk about our current situation. The example that you might use that illustrates sort of what it is that you would have said before Trump got elected that no president of the United States could ban Muslims or cage children and separate them from their children. And by doing those things and enacting those things and getting away with them, the window of what is possible and possibly what's acceptable has kind of shifted in the public imagination. And this window moves around all the time depending on what's going on in the world. And we recognised that we needed to move that on the possibility of human extinction and the rate of the extinction crisis that we're living through. And we also recognised that we needed to move the Overton window in terms of what makes a realistic and appropriate response to this, because certainly within my lifetime I haven't seen lots of protesters risk jail, I haven't seen lots of protesters on hunger strike, I haven't seen people sort of taking these kinds of levels of sacrificial action which we've started to advocate for in terms of giving up something quite personal in order to make yourself heard. So in science we talk about the precautionary principle. The precautionary principle is a very well-known concept. It's embedded in lots and lots of policy in Europe, and basically means that you don't have to know for absolute sure that something is going to be catastrophic in order to act to mitigate it. So we're not using the precautionary principle in a meaningful way at the moment with regards to climate change and policy writing and also international collaboration. And a lot of people are asking for certainty of the science, but the fact is if you want to know for sure whether the boat's going to hit the rocks before you take action, then of course it's going to crash before you do anything about it. So the rules don't necessarily apply when you understand that you're headed for a huge catastrophe. And within science, you find that because it's peer-reviewed and it goes through lots of processes to make sure that it is rigorously checked by the community, by the academic community, you'll get a very different conversation with a scientist down the pub about their concerns about climate change to what you would hear in a peer-reviewed paper that they would write much more carefully. And then further again, when you go to the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, their information that they put out is even more conservative again. partly because they take it from a hugely wide range of data, of everything that they can find in that area, which means that often their reports take several years to come out as well, which means that their information can already be 3 years old before we hear how alarming it is. And the latest data that people have discovered in the recent months have certainly not been through and come through an IPCC report. So you're not hearing the cutting edge information, and you're also getting a sort of relatively conservative output. The other thing that it's important to know about the IPCC report, in that we get most of our information on climate from that internationally, is that it goes also through panels of economists and politicians. So the outcome of those reports is not purely scientific, but it's also highly politicized. Now, the actual data that you find on climate change is often, it's been often described that the pessimists are always the closest to the truth. So when you take a reading and you check back against the projection from a few years back, you usually find that the worst case scenario is what we have playing out. And this is a slightly old graph now, but it effectively shows you just the projected loss of sea ice in the Arctic, which you can see as a model runs over towards looking like we probably have ice there until about 2100, and that was a model that was broadly believed until relatively recently. And the red line shows you the observations. So we know that the outcome of climate breakdown won't be played out in a linear fashion. We're going to experience a non-linear change to our global environment. And it's also, I think, reasonable to say that whilst we might have called certain types of scientists alarmists for saying the Arctic is going to go very, very much faster than the IPCC ever predicted, those people are looking closer and closer to the truth every year. And there are some quite credible climate scientists that think we could lose the Arctic next year completely. This is Professor Schellnhuber. I would really recommend that you look him up if you're interested in the science. He's a physicist who started, I think founded the Potsdam Institute. He's an extremely credible voice in this area internationally. He advises Angela Merkel and the Pope on climate issues. And he wrote a foreword for a paper last year called What Lies Beneath, and it was about the understatement of the risk. So what he framed in the opening of that paper, which I think was fundamentally important for us to understand where we are with this situation, was that we're not using a risk assessment approach really. If you spoke to a risk assessment professional and said we have a 20% chance at the moment of a total catastrophe, or we have a 50% chance of a massive catastrophe, they would tell you that's absurd odds. Nobody would insure anything with anywhere near those odds of going wrong. And because science uses statistical analysis just on the most basic way, you could also say that we have a 0% risk of human extinction, simply because it's never happened before. So we don't have any data on that. And it's important to know as well that if there's something that we can't model well, the IPCC don't include it in their reports. So there are no feedback loops in their reports, which I'm going to go on and explain to you now. So there's probably, there are many feedback loops and a variety of tipping points that scientists have identified within the climate change sort of system. And I won't go into all of them now, but I'll just talk about some top line ones. And really the situation is so far advanced that I don't think it's necessary to explain everything in great detail, because you only need to know a few to know that we're really in fucking trouble, basically. So one of the most simple and easy to explain feedback mechanisms that's in the system is the albedo effect. And the albedo effect is when the sun hits the planet and it reflects off the white ice, and the majority of the heat and the energy is reflected back into space. And that happens wherever there is a white surface, and that prevents the Earth's atmosphere from absorbing a huge amount of energy and heat. So obviously as the ice melts and the permafrost thaws, we lose white surface and you gain dark surface, you gain dark water, and it's basic physics. White reflects it and the dark surface absorbs it. So for all the ice we lose, we gain momentum in heating, and that's why it's called a positive feedback loop, because it makes itself worse and worse and worse. It's been estimated that once you lose the Arctic sea ice, you'll lose it in, say, September, around the hottest time of the year. And so there's this unprecedented warming going on in the Arctic, and what it means is that the ice is shrinking faster and faster. The glaciers are melting much more quickly than we could have ever expected. Once you lose the ice in, say, September of one year, it will return, but it's guessed by the scientists that once you've lost it one summer, you've probably got about a decade where it will return smaller, and then it will disappear again in the summer, and eventually you've lost it after about 10 years completely. And without the polar regions being the coldest points on the planet, we lose the stability of all of our weather systems, which are pretty much controlled by the fact that there is hot air around the middle and cold air at the top, and everything is kept fairly well in line. So that's why, whilst we've seen this kind of disruption of the patterns with the beast from the east, and the summer heat waves and stuff, so those patterns are getting disrupted, and that's why we get heat waves and polar vortex, which bring monsoon-style rains and things like that. That's a very basic explanation of that. I'm not the best to explain it in detail, but you get the picture. And over the climate connections in Yale say that this means that climate change, you must understand it as more like a vicious circle. So at certain temperatures, we expect other tipping points and feedbacks. So one feedback is that the Amazon will die back or burn down, or a bit of both. So regardless of whether anyone chops it down, that is likely to happen somewhere between 2 and 3 degrees of global average warming. And that's significant because it turns a carbon sink into a carbon producer, and it never will flip back the other way. And when you talk about a tipping point in science, the most basic way to describe it is like tipping over a glass of water. The water goes from being in one state in the glass to being spilt everywhere, and it's in quite a different state. You can't put it back how it was before, and that's what it means when you go for a tipping point in the climate system. It won't be something that we can sort of do something to engineer a reversal of those effects. Now, last year there were several breakthrough academic papers and scientific reports where lots of scientists came together and said fairly unprecedented things. Schoenhuber was one of them. The other paper that came out was this PNAS paper, which gave us all those headlines you might remember about hothouse Earth, and about how the Earth could tip into a hot state that we couldn't get it out of. And Johan Rockström has said 50 years ago this would be dismissed as alarmist, but now scientists have really become very worried. So this is also a diagram that will just show you where you've got other tipping point sort of temperatures that push systems into a hothouse state. So there are issues around ocean currents, there's issues around sea ice, permafrost we expect to emit very large amounts of methane. Nobody seems to have a super accurate data on this, but effectively frozen rock contains methane gas. That is estimated to be around 20 times as strong a greenhouse gas as carbon dioxide, so methane is not our friend. It's actually more potent when it's released around the poles, so that's terrible news because that's where we expect to see some of that come out. So there are lots and lots of problems that we face. And currently global average temperatures are around 1.1 to 1.2 degrees above the pre-industrial average. They have been rising at about 0.17 degrees per decade, but rises, as I said, won't be linear as they play out. The graph there shows you the temperature increase, and here it's worth noting that the University of Washington used the warming estimates from the UN last year, and they said that we've got at the moment a 1% chance of hitting 1.5 degrees of total average warming, and that we've only got a 5% chance that we'll stay below 2 degrees C, and the likely medium range by the end of this century is somewhere around 3.2, although of course it's very difficult to predict. Shortly after we put this presentation together, there were some new reports that came that said we could even breach 1.5 within 5 years, and that's what we were warned last year by the IPCC would be the optimum place to curb warming. We will see sea level rise, and the World Bank has predicted that by 2050 140 million people are going to be displaced. This isn't just something that's going to scale up the migration and refugee crisis that we see at the moment, but we've got an internal migration problem as well. And that's really something that I think very few people are talking about. And the list of places here, you probably all know people that live in one of them: Aberdeen, Newcastle, Portsmouth, Belfast, Cardiff, Southampton, Bristol, Brighton, Middlesbrough, Plymouth, Lincolnshire. All of these places are going to be affected, and people will lose their homes. It's also interesting to know that if you want to know the truth about the reality of climate change, you can think about looking to the insurance industries, who are already openly having conversations about when they're going to stop insuring basement apartments in coastal cities like London and Mumbai and New York. And they're quite open about those conversations. So other ecological pressures that we're facing, we're trying not to be solely a climate change movement, although we can sometimes get called that. It's important to us that we also recognise the breadth of the ecological crisis that we're in. So ocean acidification, you might not know that the ocean is changing pH because of carbon emissions. The majority of carbon that we've ever emitted has gone straight into the sea. It soaks it in and it changes the acidity level. So the oceans changing their pH are very significant because we don't have any idea how we could possibly reverse that, and it damages the conditions for which some of the creatures at the very base of the food chain form their shells. So very tiny things, anything that makes a shell basically, but some of them are very small. So we're really undermining the entire food chain in the sea, aside from the plastics, which obviously are horrendous, but they seem to have gotten a great deal of attention because you can really see them. We also have air pollution, which is, the World Health Organization says is the biggest threat to human life apart from climate change, climate collapse. We're polluting our fresh water supplies very rapidly. We've got water depletion issues. Those issues are going to get worse whilst we have more desertification, more flooding, and soil erosion and soil infertility is also something that we don't have enough conversations about. Michael Gove's own statistic is that we could be 30 to 40 harvests away from a total loss of fertility in British soil. We only grow quite a small percentage of our own food in this country, but what we do grow may not be able to even grow in a few decades time. And then you have deforestation and habitat loss. So apart from the fact that we're destroying the world's carbon sinks and lungs of the earth, which often the Amazon gets called the lungs of the earth, I actually think the ocean is the lungs of the earth. But whilst we destroy all of these habitats, we destroy the conditions for natural life at the same time as destroying our own chances of life. We expect also, just to note on the food production topic, that if we have another, say, 3 years worth of summer heat waves like the ones that we just experienced, and the UK lost a huge amount of its crops. Some farmers last year lost about 50% of their crops because of the heat wave. So if we have another couple of years of those conditions, then we will burn through our stocks, like in reserve of grain, which we hold as a sort of safety net for society. So we usually hold, I think it's somewhere 40 to 60% of reserve for a year's supply, so that there's always extra food. But if you lose that many crops for several years in a row, then you'll have no backup, and then we can anticipate a global food crisis that will affect people here in this country and around Europe. So it's not just the people in other countries with different colour skin that are going to get the brunt of this. Like, quickly we could feel it here much faster than anybody's really recognising. So there's been 5 major extinctions in the past we can find in the geological record. The Permian-Triassic extinction shows that there were conditions there where runaway climate change caused massive methane release and wiped out 97% of life on the face of the planet. And most of these events do seem to have wiped out the majority of all of life in all forms all over the planet. And we are in an extinction event at the moment, and some people say adding carbon to the atmosphere faster and experiencing faster warming than we can find in any of the previous extinction events on record. The scientists started to use this term biological annihilation a few years ago. Wildlife is dying out because of habitat destruction, overhunting and toxic pollution, invasion by alien species and climate change. The loss of all of the insects is anticipated, I think, by most people to be largely to do with combination of changes in temperatures and massive use of chemicals in the natural world. But the ultimate cause you might see systemically of all of these things is overconsumption, and that's particularly by the rich, and that's all of us. Species endangered include 1 in 4 mammals, 1 in 8 birds, 1/3 of all amphibians and 70% of the world's assessed plants. And a study of British mammals last year estimated that 1 in 5 could be extinct within a decade. And the numbers on the puffins there show you something real in terms of 33,000 puffins counted in 2000, which have now just 570 individuals. There was another paper that came, which was a scientific reviewed paper that recognised the possibility of human extinction, and it's interesting when you can find these things emerging in the scientific community in places where people really need to be able to back that up. And it's estimated that the amount of carbon that we've put into the atmosphere already presents a 1 in 20 chance that we could have already altered the atmosphere enough to create a runaway warming event, and that's been described by the people in this paper as a 1 in 20 chance that the plane that you get on is going to crash. And people don't get on planes that have those odds of crashing, but we are in effect putting our children and our grandchildren on that plane. Another terrifying paper that came out last year, Professor Jem Bendel, it's called Deep Adaptation. I think most academic papers are downloaded an average of 3 times, and this has been downloaded over 100,000 times, I think, now. All over the world people are reading this paper, because he really gathered what we've done with this talk in a similar way, sort of gathered a lot of data from different places and said, if you put all of this together, like, there's no way that we can mitigate anything. We've done it. Like, we've just totally missed the opportunity to do that. We've wasted all of the time that we knew for the last 30 years that we needed to address it. And now calling for, I suppose, a rigorous conversation about adaptation and what that means, because we know that we need to adapt to the effects of climate change now. And his sort of hierarchy, if you like, of what he expects to play out is that societal collapse is inevitable and it could happen quite soon. Immense catastrophe is very likely, so there's very, very large loss of human life, and human extinction is possible. Other life extinction already in process on a very large scale. And that there's a possible mechanism that could lead to social collapse in about 3 years' time. So adaptation is very urgently needed. And that's, again, if you look him up, you'll hear him talk a lot about food security and the fact that societies just basically break down if people can't get fed. And we don't really, I think, have any understanding of what that might be like in this kind of country. I don't think I've got any concept really of what the reality is to live in a society that's falling apart because people are struggling to get enough food into their homes to feed their families. And so the warning signs of fascism, you might recognise some of those as things that you understand are present in our daily lives and in sort of emerging politics around the world. It's important to know that fear and destructiveness are usually the main sources of fascism, and we think it's important to recognise that when people face grave risk and scarcity, and somebody comes with a simple political solution, which quite often blames somebody that's very easy to point at and single out, that those things we've sort of felt are around us right now, and that the conditions that we anticipate climate change and collapse to bring will present an opportunity for this kind of for fascism to hijack democracy again, as it has over and over again over the years. And Douglas Rushkoff, who's a professor, is very interesting. If you haven't heard of him, look him up. He publishes his writing on Medium. He wrote this blog piece last year, which was kind of a whistleblowing piece, saying that he'd been invited to speak at a public event with some very influential hedge fund managers, and when he showed up, it wasn't a public event at all. It was just a group of people sat around a table that wanted to ask him some very in-depth questions about technology and the future. And they asked him basically, what should we invest in, Bitcoin, Ethereum, some fairly sort of innocuous questions about technology in the future. But it went on to ask to really be focused on what they would do in the coming climate crisis. So which region will be less impacted by the crisis, New Zealand or Alaska? And finally the CEO of a brokerage house explaining that he'd nearly completed building his own underground bunker system, and asked, how do I maintain authority over my security forces after the event? So these people are well aware that collapse is ahead, and what they don't know is how they get people to manage their security for them when money is worthless and lots of people don't have enough food to eat. I think if you read that piece, you'll read to the end and hear Douglas write that, at least ordinary people don't have to think about shit like this, because we know that we know that we'd rather do a different route, thank you very much, which is to actually try and fix the problem and work together and not isolate ourselves in biospheres and bunkers and, rely on technology that doesn't exist. So government policy in the UK, we've had the most appalling couple of decades, or maybe the last 3 decades. Tony Juniper says it's the worst period for environmental policy right now that we've had in 30 years, but it's been pretty bad pretty consistently. This Conservative government have scrapped onshore wind support, they've scrapped solar subsidies, they've scrapped the Green Homes Scheme, they've sold off the Green Investment Bank, they've given less incentive to buy sustainable and green cars, they've ditched green tax targets, and they've refused tidal power projects at the same time as they have proposed and managed to vote through an expansion of Heathrow Airport, which will have the carbon emissions equivalent of Cyprus if it gets set up and running. And they've subsidised fracking and forced it on local communities who absolutely didn't want it and who've been engaged in sort of struggle on the ground, which you may know about for many years now. So the government are just not doing anything meaningful about this, and I recently met some people who work with NGOs, and they explained some stuff to me about the context of the political situation as they see it, and I have to say that the political situation, having been given a more clear view in there, it was like someone pulled back the curtain and there was nothing there. And I thought it was going to be something disappointing, but I didn't think it would be so empty. And so I'm personally now more concerned about the politicians than I am about the physics, and I read science and cry fairly often. So when you face the lack of any meaningful action that we've experienced and that's brought us to this position, the first IPCC report was in 1990, that's a long time ago. The UN said if we went above 1 degree of average warming, then we could face societal collapse. Of course, we've already breached that point, and we've not quite seen society collapse yet, but that's what they predicted. CO2 levels are 60% higher than they were in 1990 now, so that's we've not done anywhere near what they recommended us to do. They're still going up. Methane emissions are going up. You might also know methane is emitted every time you frack for gas or every time you mine for anything in the ground. So at the point of fossil fuel extraction, we inevitably produce a really potent greenhouse gas before we even burn any of the fuels. I also think that it's important to keep reiterating that at some point the problems will run away from us. So Professor Kevin Anderson, who's a climate scientist who's fairly well acclaimed within his sector for being somebody who won't get on planes because he's not because he doesn't want to be a hypocrite, which lots of people who are invested in trying to fight climate change fly around the world constantly trying to do that job. But he's very outspoken. I'd recommend you look him up as well if you're interested to find more out. He says we would rather question physics than our economic model. There have been a litany of technocratic frauds. We haven't tried real mitigation, and long-term targets undermine real mitigation today. Scientists are reluctant to admit how challenging their Paris agreements actually are. Scientists have been self-censoring, and biomass energy and carbon capture and storage, policymakers are relying on negative emissions technologies that don't exist. So you may or may not know that the Paris Climate Agreement has been written and signed based on a certain amount of carbon capture and storage technology, which countries can implement to effectively remove carbon from the atmosphere that we've put there. And actually, that technology until recently basically didn't really exist. It didn't work properly. It does work now, but it's not scaled, and I don't think it is scalable. It was estimated that the technology that's been developed needs to be scaled by about 2 million times starting right now to have a meaningful impact in helping us meet the targets that we need to meet. So writing policy based on something that you might be able to invent in the future doesn't feel to me like work that I want my politicians to be doing. And this is Dr. Kate Marvel from NASA's Goddard Institute, and she says we need courage, not hope. To be a climate scientist is to be an active participant in a slow motion horror story. As a scientist, I'm often asked to talk about hope, and particularly in the political climate. Audiences want to be told that everything is going to be all right in the end. And climate change is bleak, the organisers always say. Tell us a happy story. Please give us hope. But the problem is, I don't have any. So, I said at the beginning, and I'll just reiterate that it's okay, that this is really sad and really difficult to take in. And I've spoken to lots of people at our lectures who really come and say that they're grateful for having somewhere where they can talk about this stuff, because a lot of people's family and friends aren't on the same page as them. And we do regularly have meetings where people get upset, and I cried a lot when I met the NGOs last week. And that's okay, actually, and I've never felt more okay with being able to get upset in public places as I do now that I'm doing this work, and I feel hugely supported by the people that I'm working with and who understand the sort of scale of the situation that we're in. And so I just ask everybody to support each other if you've got friends in the room, or even if you haven't, to talk about stuff afterwards and make sure that you keep in touch with each other. And really, once you understand what this all means, the question for us is, how does it affect the way that you want to live your life? And what does it mean to make an appropriate response to the situation that we've been put in by the systemic failure of our society and our politicians to do anything?